Welcome to episode 2 of the Liminal Space podcast. This is Tristan.
And this is Rashid.
In this episode, we'll be talking about faith with a particular focus on Christian theology. And so we thought it's important to talk about our faith, to put the conversation into context. So, Rashid, what is your, background, faith background?
Yeah, so I've always believed in God as long as I can remember. I have a Muslim dad and a Jewish mom. Grew up, obviously, in Cape Town and everything, immersed in different contexts. And around varsity time, like first year varsity, which was 2012, I started becoming interested in Christianity. I've always been someone who's sort of had just a love for God and a belief in the Creator. And started being interested in this other story of God, which I sort of heard in Christian spaces. Growing up, we were never like anti-Christian or anti any religion. I guess I was brought up to always have respect and understanding for different religions, and also appreciation as well of different religions. So we'll chat more about it later in the podcast, but I don't necessarily love the term Christian. I think that there's been so many harmful imaginations that have been acted out in the name of Christianity. So I don't necessarily resonate with that term or the term Christian, but I do, as we'll discuss, throughout this episode, I do love Jesus. And I think that Jesus is amazing. And I do think that the message of the gospel is good news for the whole world, for everyone. So, yeah.
So I grew up in a Christian home. I grew up Anglican when I was an altar boy. And I guess my journey was quite religious, growing up. I went to church every week. But later on, probably also my 20s is interesting, or quite formative years. My 20s, my faith became more, I would say, more concrete. It was deeper. And I guess at that point decided that my life would be led in a way that was shaped by my faith, particularly my faith in Jesus. So Jesus is a very important figure, and the story of Jesus is quite important to me and how I choose to live my life. I am okay with the term or the label Christian, I think. So I still carry that and it does have, like as you said, Rashid, some of the negative stuff is there. Well, my processing for now is that it's still okay. And so I do carry that. The person we have with us today is Thandi Gamedze. Thandi is a writer, a poet, a facilitator, and soon-to-be postdoctorate fellow at the Desmond Tutu Center for Religion and Social Justice at the University of the Western Cape. The glue that connects all of the varied bits and pieces of Thandi's work is a deep commitment to the work of critique and reimagining as both action and reflection towards a world that is just, nurturing and kind. Thandi is based in Cape Town, South Africa, and works for the Warehouse, an organization which envisions a reality in which churches are living out the peace and justice of God for the world. So welcome, Thandi, and we are recording from Cape Town in the lush suburb of Rondebosch, somewhere close to Main Road, but also close to the University of Cape Town. And I wondered, Thandi, whether you'd share, how did you come to be in Rondebosch?
I suppose initially through my relationship with the University of Cape Town. So I did my undergraduate degree there quite a long time ago. But at some point I lived here with my brother and one of my sisters, and there's been various iterations of that over the years. But I moved back here a couple of years ago now. So, yeah.
Very cool. And you're from Joburg originally. Where were you born?
Wow, that's a longer story as well. I was born in Eswatini, Mbabane, the capital. Yeah. And then my mum's British and my dad's South African. So then we lived in the UK in Bristol for a while, and then in 95 moved to South Africa, to Joburg. So I went to most of primary school and high school in Joburg, and then came to Cape Town to study.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
You're a child of the world.
Child of the world. Yes.
We spoke in episode 1 a lot about stories and this idea of storytelling and imagination. And a question that you'll see we're going to ask other guests in future episodes, which the first one we're asking is, what stories ground you in your life? And you can sort of interpret that in any way you want to.
So I think, there's multiple, I guess, stories that ground me. I mean, hearing both of you reflect on your relationship to Christianity and faith, I mean, that's been a very central story in my life as well. I grew up going to church my whole life, and so the Christian faith has always been a very central part of my story, and quite a grounding aspect of who I am, I think, in various seasons of my life, and questions that I've had about the world and things. That's kind of been this thing that's constantly been with me. And I think, I mean, it's been a space of questioning as well, I think, for various different reasons, and I've had various questions of it. So I think that's part of the thing that marks my relationship with Christianity. It has always been this space of grappling, and what the grappling is, I think, has been different in different times of my life. But I think, that's always been something central to my faith, this space to kind of question and wrestle and come to something different. So that's I think been one of those stories. And then a biblical story that's been really important to me, I think, over the past few years maybe, has been the story of Moses. And I think many people think about Moses as this in the context of the Exodus, where the Hebrew people were liberated from enslavement by the Egyptians, by Pharaoh, and that, I mean, that's also definitely why Moses is an important character to me. But I think Moses is don't know how to say that, but his own personal story is one that I resonate with a lot. And I think it has links to, so your podcast is called the liminal space, liminal
That is a word
podcast.
confirmed. It does exist, yes.
It does exist, yes. But I think that's been, so that ties into this for me, like the idea of liminality and of being in between, whether that's like in between geographies or in between different identities. That feels like it's been something that's marked my life in many different ways. Moving across different spaces. My mom is white and my dad's black, so that kind of grappling with race and what that means. But this constant feeling of being in between different spaces, and from that space, the thing of home and of belonging being very important when you feel like you don't quite belong in any space. And so I think that's something that Moses deeply grappled with as someone who was part of the Hebrew tribe, the Hebrew people, but then grew up in Pharaoh's palace because of the whole story. He was born, and Pharaoh wanted to kill all the Hebrew children, and so his mom floated him away in a basket to protect him, and then he got picked up by Pharaoh's daughter and ended up growing up in the palace. So had this life of deep privilege, but was also connected to these people who were being deeply oppressed in society. And that being such a grapple for him, like when I read that, and I think the piece, and this is not promoting violence or murder in any way, but for me the thing when he, so as the story goes, he sees one of, and I think it says this, his fellow Hebrews, so one of his people being beaten up by an Egyptian slave master. And then he kills the Egyptian who is doing the beating up. And I mean, this causes complication on all sides. Like, no one's actually happy that he did this. But for me, it kind of represents a really significant moment where he overtly separated himself from the empire. And killing the Egyptian, it feels like he was almost killing the part of himself that had been socialized within the palace and identifying himself with the oppressed. And so that feels like it's a very formative and foundational story for me, and it feels like there's a lot in there.
Do you have a Moses-like moment for yourself where there's a realization or a point of thing where was Moses woke? I don't know. There's an awakening that happens, you know. Yeah. Do you is there like something like that happens for you somewhere in your life?
I mean, definitely. I wouldn't say there's necessarily one particular moment, but many moments. I mean, so I spent some time in the US, and I won't go into the details of why I was there or what I was doing there. But there was some stuff going on there around the Black Lives Matter movement, and so some of the stuff that was happening in that space, the space that I was in was very white, but there was like a relatively small group of Black people trying to think about what that meant in such a white space, and trying to think about race within the context of what was happening with police brutality towards Black people in the US.
And just for context, this was a church space.
This was a church space, yeah. So I think that was a really important space for me in terms of, I think, thinking about race outside of the context that I grew up in. There is something about like being sort of separated from your context, which allows you to see your context in different ways. So I think some of my language, and the thing is, you, as a Black person growing up in this country, in an embodied way, you know what's going on and you get it. Even as a kid, like you put into place different ways of being and things to survive. So innately you get what's going on and you respond to it in different ways. But I think that was a space where I started to get more language about it and was able to like reflect on it from a bit of a distance, which allowed me, I think, to see it in different ways. While I was there also, it was over 2015 and I think a little bit of 2016. And that was when the Rhodes Must Fall and Fees Must Fall movement was happening back here, which obviously I wasn't part of because I was in the US, but my siblings were very, very much involved. So I was kind of reading about that and seeing what was going on and hearing from them in that space. And that definitely was an important moment, I think, in my consciousness, and seeing some of the response to what they were doing and just being so horrified at the police brutality in that, and seeing it from a distance, but also in a way that was very close because my siblings were involved. So I think those definitely were moments of awakening for me. But I really do think it's a progressive. It happens progressively, and there's so many moments, and that's something I definitely believe, that we never arrive in a place, but are always growing and figuring things out and being formed. Yeah.
I was thinking just with regards to Moses' story, and you know how later on it speaks about how he was scared when God said, "No, I've called you to basically liberate the enslaved Israelites," and he was scared too. And then obviously God said, "No, it's fine. We'll use Aaron," and everything like that. But I wonder if, just looking at it from maybe in the context that you're speaking about, this idea of, I know Tristan, you asked, is like that rejection of empire as being like a moment. But I also feel like if you've socialized by empire, it's going to be a constant thing in your life where
Totally.
you reject, and then you're like, okay, I find myself coming back into, you know, empirical thoughts or imaginings. Because I do think even empire and stuff, and how even socialization and stuff works, is it's in our minds. So even when we talk about stuff like decolonization, a lot of the time for me, a starting point is our minds, our imagination. So I wonder that I'm reflecting this because I'm thinking of my own life. That you were talking about this in between, the liminality of like upbringing and heritage and stuff. And for me as well, being Muslim and Jewish, and then colored and white. By the way, if there's any Americans listening to this, colored is a completely acceptable term here in South Africa. It refers to like a very large group of people, a lot of the time in the Western Cape, who have like diverse backgrounds. I found that in the last few years, I've been writing a couple of things about like even thoughts on theology and those kind of things. And when I'll return to something that I wrote even a year ago, I'm like, bro, what were you thinking at the time? Like, that feels so lame. But it's obviously, as we go through life, our minds, our imagination, you know, changes and transforms. And just referring to this idea of like that humility of not being a theological expert, because all of us are just growing and learning. And also, I also think there's a lot of times where we do, just to be honest, re-interact with empire. I mentioned earlier my idea of the good news and the gospel. It's part of undoing those things, and constantly in our life always choosing a different story, something else.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely feels like such a continual thing. Like, it's the thing that we live in and are embroiled in and complicit in so many ways. So yeah, there can never be a moment where I think that stuff is gone. So I actually wrote a piece on this about Moses's liberation journey. And yeah, in that, talking about how it is such a continual journey. And I think that that moment of killing the Egyptian within himself, let's say, because I'm not advocating for violence, I think that was a key moment, and I think there'll be key moments of that for all of us. But I think it is as something that we live in and are complicit in, and are connected to in so many ways. I think it is a continual journey to kill empire, however it shows up in all of us. And then I think there's also an element of that with God as well. So that was kind of another piece that I talked about, but that it's not only us that need to be separated from empire, but it's also God also needs to become decolonized, or become liberated, and not necessarily saying that it's a different God, but that it's that our understanding of God needs to become liberated. So the patriarchal pieces of God need to become liberated. The racist aspects of God and of our faith need to be liberated, so that we can be left with this decolonial and decolonizing God.
I mean, okay, so now we're going deep with the thing, and some people Some people say we only talk about empire in Cape Town. The Joburg people don't talk about empire.
They
But
don't,
anyway,
bro. I've had conversations. Joburg friends, guys, please, man.
But so it's so interesting because we've before started recording, we had a conversation about different versions of God, but it was different versions of Jesus, I guess. And we were at that demonstration together, a counter demonstration, a couple of weeks ago. I wondered if maybe you can share the context of what was happening there. But there was a specific moment that I remembered that forced this question about, like, which God do you believe in? So maybe give us the context of that.
Okay.
Sunday. It was a Sunday.
Yeah, it was a Sunday. Okay, I'll give the context of the demonstration, and then maybe you can share about that. That piece. So, basically, what had happened is that a few of us had seen that this group who call themselves Time to Rise SA had put out a call for a national day of prayer, and as part of this call, part of it was to pray for Israel and to distance themselves, they said, from the South African government's decision to go to the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, and put Israel on trial for genocide, basically. And they said, this is because if we curse Israel, then we will get cursed. And they pulled out a passage of scripture from Genesis, which says something along these lines. So we were obviously not happy about this and felt that there needed to be an alternative Christian voice saying something different. You guys have been talking about stories and alternative narratives. And so this Christian Zionism who supports Israel and seems to be okay with the genocide that they are carrying out is this one Christian narrative that is very strong, actually, in South Africa, but around the world. And we wanted to say there is actually another Christian narrative here. There's another Christian voice that is advocating for justice, advocating for ceasefire at the very least, but for liberation for Palestinians, and for all people who are oppressed everywhere. And so the group was going to meet at Parliament, and so we decided to do a counter demonstration or counter protest, a silent protest, where we would take posters with scriptures and just other symbols and messages of solidarity with the people of Palestine. So this was the context, and this is what we did on the Sunday. And then, Tristan, what did you
Well, so we were
see?
standing there, quite awkwardly, to be honest. There was a smallish group of us, but included some clergy, some bishops, I think they were, from, I don't know from which church they were, but there were some bishops that were there and a couple of other people. And we held up a poster, a long poster, that had the names of, I believe it was all the children that at that point had been killed in Gaza. And the tagline onto the heading of the poster was, "Are these not the least of these?" I think that's what the title was. And so the idea was that it would just be very silent and non-confrontational as an alternative to offer the counter narrative, an alternative Christian voice who are also followers of Jesus. And there were two moments that I thought was very interesting that happened while we were standing there. Because when we were standing there, that kind of the other group started breaking off, and I guess they were finished. But a lady had come our direction, and then she said, I don't know which Bible you were reading. I guess she's inferring that that what they are standing for in that moment is what the Bible says, and that what we are standing for is not. Which is a super, because then there's two different versions of the Bible we're talking about now. And then at the same time, someone else had come, and I think they were from the protest at Parliament filming, and he said something like, these are the children of Jesus standing here, and he was pointing at us, and he said, those are not the children of Jesus, which was over there. And I think a bunch of us standing there felt like, I guess there was a little discomfort because, well, I think maybe they are also the children of Jesus. All of us are. It's just, It's a very complicated situation. But those things made me think about. You wrote a poem that you shared at one of the demonstrations in support of Gaza, which speaks about Jesus, and you say the brown skin Jesus. And I wondered if we could talk about what that, like, why is there even a need to say the brown skin Jesus? And because there seems to be two different stories that are occurring there.
Totally. And I think just so to begin by saying maybe, and this is in response to something that Rashid said earlier, but that the discomfort with calling yourself Christian when there are these things going on, when Donald Trump also calls himself Christian, as do these people who are sending weapons and bombs to Israel. But I think there is something powerful about reclaiming it in a way, because in certain ways it's easier to distance ourselves from it and be like, it's not the same faith. And yet, and I think in certain ways there's power in doing that. But it is as you say, it's our Bible, it's our sacred text that's being used. It's our faith that's being used in these different ways. So there is also a power and a need, I think, to take that narrative back. And so, and I think in a way that's part of what I was doing in the poem. So this Jesus who's been being used to justify what's going on in Gaza, but also has been used to justify apartheid and colonialism in various ways. And so contextualizing this Jesus in Palestine, so the poem's called Jesus of Occupied Palestine, and that was Jesus's context, this space occupied by Rome at the time, and that's the context in which he grew up and came into adulthood and being. So there's that thing of trying to contextualize Jesus, and that he was a brown-skinned man, was a Palestinian man, you could say. I mean, grew up in Palestine. It wasn't necessarily called that at the time. But I think that was an effort to reclaim Jesus. And you say, why is it necessary to say that Jesus was a brown man? And I think because Jesus has been appropriated and colonized and made into a white patriarchal kind of power-loving person or being, who doesn't mind that children are getting bombed and doesn't have anything to say about social issues and politics, and is quite happy with all of these things going on as long as we are praying and going to church and doing these things. So I think that's what we are rescuing Jesus from, or liberating Jesus from, in recontextualizing him as a brown Palestinian man who was one of the oppressed, who was occupied himself under Roman occupation. Because I think that brings us to a very different starting point, if that's the Jesus that we're talking about. That Jesus has everything to say about settler colonialism, that Jesus has everything to say about occupation, about genocide, about all kinds of social and political issues, that Jesus can't be silent about those kinds of things. Jesus of Occupied Palestine. If Jesus were alive today, and I do mean the brown Jesus, the one who grew up in occupied Palestine, the Roman Empire a constant threat, its military weaponized against anyone stepping out of line, the Jesus whose welcome into the world was tainted by violence, air resounding with Roman ally King Herod's order for the genocide of all boy children in Bethlehem. If that Jesus were alive today, it's clear where he would be. Likely making his way south, dodging bombs and white phosphorus rain, mourning family and friends whose homes had been turned to rubble while they were sleeping inside. Healing powers compromised in the face of all the casualties, lament the only plausible response to the devastation. That Jesus would have no water to turn into wine, because Israel has poured cement into the supply and cut off all means to access. His supernatural abilities would be tested in this humanitarian crisis, because the 5,000 hungry people have themselves multiplied to 2 million, and even 5 loaves and 2 fishes are hard to find. I'm quite sure he would be scared, just as when contemplating his imminent crucifixion, drained of all hope in the face of this empire's inhumanity, he'd probably turn to prayer as he did the day before his murder. God, would you take this cup of suffering from us and free Palestine?
The reason this is important, whether you are Christian or not, is because bad theology kills. So if that version of Christianity where you said where people are signing off on the bombs and all of that kind of literally leads to the death of people. And there probably are other kinds of ways that happens as well, not just with bombs and things. But Rashid, you have a famous story, not about bombs, but about this idea of like there's a certain version of Jesus, or maybe Jesus and Christianity, that is quite different to I guess where we both land these days.
Yeah, so a couple of years ago, probably about 7 or 8 years ago, I went to this, I think it was like a 10-day school for like supernatural ministry and stuff. And the idea was, they told us, we must go out, minister to people and preach the word. And the whole thing was, at the end of the day, we're going to come back and we're going to count how many altar calls. And then we did that, and it was like 27 altar calls, woo! And then everyone's celebrating, and then it's like, cool, next thing the next day, right? So I was with like a couple of friends and stuff who were also obviously at the on the camp. And we landed up in Fishhook the one day. We were in the parking lot, and there was this one guy who we were speaking to. Spoke a little bit to him and found out a little bit about his story. He was a car guard there, and we discovered he's homeless, and he like just lives, around different places in Fishhook. Anyway, so then I just remember we kept on speaking to this guy, and we're like, okay, but Jesus, he came, and we, I guess, preached what I view now as quite a limited lens of the gospel, which is strictly about personal salvation and that idea. I do think there's a lot more. I'm not saying that's not part of the gospel, but I do think there's a lot more to the good news. Anyway, so we are basically trying to coerce this guy into repeating this prayer after us. And at some point, I remember him saying, there was a lady who came here like a few months ago, and I repeated it after her. And like, it's like, my life's still the same, like nothing changed. It wasn't like after he did that supernaturally, like I said, he was homeless. So it's not like later that night he experienced warmth, like Jesus came as a blanket and covered him. That nothing like that happened. And for him, he was just like so desperate and destitute. He's also been so overlooked and marginalized by like the city. I don't think he was South African. I think he was from a different country in Africa. I can't remember. It was quite a few years ago. And anyway, so I just remember this experience, and we did eventually now convince him to repeat this thing. And later that day, I went to like one of the leaders of the camp, and I was like, there was this guy who we spoke to, and I think we maybe took people's numbers or something like that. I can't really remember. And I was like, there was this guy, and I feel like he needs more than just what we gave him. I was like, aren't there maybe like some local churches that he can get plugged into and that kind of thing? And I remember this guy was the leader of the camp. He was just like, that's always a difficult thing, like post altar call, what you kind of do. And I remember going away from that experience, just realizing that there's something missing in my theology. There's gaps in my theology. And for me, it was this idea that the good news, surely the good news has to extend, the good news has to have answers. It has to be good news for this guy as well. Who, like, and he said to us, he's like, okay, I can repeat this thing after you, but I'm just going to be lying under this tree tonight. And for me, I'm like, surely good news that is good news for all of humanity and animals and the cosmos has to have answers to that problem. It can't just be satisfied. And what I realized is, nah, bro, this gospel that I had inherited, that I'd been told and taught and I guess practiced as well, is a gospel for the privileged. It's a gospel that doesn't want to get its hands dirty. It's just very comfortable, and I guess also just emphasizes hyper spiritual things as well. In my context, it's always because I love music and was always involved in like church music, worship sort of context. And in those, a lot of the time, the emphasis is also on this idea of like a holy moment, creating and facilitating a holy moment, where the emphasis is on getting like spiritual chills and like goosebumps, and it's like, wow, look at the presence of God, this is so amazing. And I'm not trying to disregard the manifest presence of God or anything like that, but just for me, if that is the ultimate goal of Christianity, to have a nice moment on a Sunday, when the band is playing, I'm like, I feel like that can be part of theology, but it can't be the crux. It can't be like, the zenith sort of point. There has to be something else. And yeah, that then led me on a journey of interrogating, I guess. You were talking about brown Jesus. For me, a lot of it was also then interrogating white Jesus.
If I were to come at it from a slightly different angle, what I was thinking about, what you're talking about, is like, if we were to believe, I'm thinking about that guy who was in the parking lot that you were there. If that guy does pray to Jesus, it just seems, and other people who are poor and oppressed, it feels like Jesus that we talk about in general is only interested in the material well-being of white people or people in power and privilege. And when you do the analysis in South Africa, that by far and large is white. So like we might want to say, oh, we don't want to make this about race, but the reality of race is there on the ground. And so like, it seems like the way I'm thinking about it is like why Jesus responds to some prayers for sometimes bigger church buildings and fully funded church projects. And there are other people who are maybe in Cape Town or in the Cape Flats or in the townships who are praying for years and years and years for breakthrough on the same things, building funds and jobs and all these things. And their prayers are not answered. And that is a dilemma then for my faith, because it's like, how do I make sense of even praying? Like, which Jesus am I praying? Which Jesus am I praying to? Which is going to answer my prayers as someone who's a person of color? Because it seems like for other people, they will say there's like a gratitude because God blessed them. But it seems like it's very concentrated only in one part of the population, which is why I think I call out that to present this counter narrative, which is something my wife has taught me about, the dominant narrative and a counter narrative, that there is a counter narrative to this dominant one about Jesus is just Jesus.
In looking at something like that, instead of something being blessings, it could just be white supremacy
and white privilege
and and capitalism,
that you just rich because the system is the way the system is,
including in church context, in ministries where it's like, wow, look, God answered our prayers, we have a new building, and it's like, cool.
Yeah.
Nice. And just to clarify, obviously the idea of talking about white and brown Jesus, it's not making it about race, because there may be one or two people who's like, oh, why are you making about race? But it's more this idea that white Jesus, for example, represents a story and an interpretation of Christianity. Mostly because of things like white supremacy, the assumption is like theological experts are all white men. So whatever their lens is like seen as sort of good and pure Christianity, and then anything else will become James Cone. Now that's liberation theology, or like, or justice theology. So there's like this othering of theology. It's like, oh, okay, yeah, that's for that context. There's this idea of like, I don't know if you guys know the term syncreticism. Like syncretic, we talk about it we talk about it in music and also in religion, where you have, like, for example, there may be an African religion and African Christianity that sort of has elements of Christianity combined with elements of like African spiritualism or something like that. And there's always this idea of, okay, Christianity is Christianity, and okay, if you're talking about like contextualizing Christianity in the African context, now you're talking about like syncretism, and it's always seen as this like, it's not like a great thing. It's not like, spoken about in a great context. And the way that I think about things now is I'm like problematizing that, and I'm saying no, but the theology we've inherited, that is syncretic, because it's so tied with Western culture, colonialism, imperialism, and all of these things. And I'm like, I actually think it's helpful to talk about that as like, even if you want to name some names like white evangelicalism, for example, I'm like, that's a syncretic interpretation of Christianity, and it's filtered through the lenses of US nationalism and American exceptionalism and all these ideas. You mentioned earlier as well, Thandi, of white Jesus being connected to like imperialism and colonialism and stuff. The reality is that I also think it's not just that white Jesus is connected to those things, it's that white Jesus is at the forefront of those things that are legislated in the name of Christianity. So something like conquest, we spoke a bit in the first episode about the like colonial idea of discovery and those kind of things. It's all legislated through Christianity. It's not, oh, Christianity was like an extra. There was that idea with discovery, like for God, for glory, and for gold. God was first. It wasn't gold, glory, and God. It was God was first. And looking at this idea of harm that is done towards people in the name of God. And then for me, a helpful framework is to say that God that you are talking about, there's not goodness in there. If we actually interrogate that story of God, that's not good. That's not this image of a good and holy and beautiful and loving God. So for me, I will find it helpful to look at that story, or look at that image of God as a story, which we can name white Jesus, and say, I reject that. I resist that as well, and I choose something different.
Christ is black, not because of some cultural or psychological need of black people, but because, and only because, Christ really enters into our world where the poor, the despised, and the black are, disclosing that he is with them, enduring their humiliation and pain, and transforming oppressed slaves into liberated servants. James Cone. A lot of people would say, like, at the center of the Christian faith is this idea of the crucifixion. And what does the crucifixion then mean to different people? Or I guess it's the crucifixion, but also what that, like, the resurrection as well, and salvation, and all of that's supposed to be good news. And I wondered I don't know what either of your thoughts are around that. Like, what does the crucifixion then mean in that, having these lenses applied to it?
I have many thoughts about that. I think there's a similar thing going on with the way that the church often thinks about crucifixion, Jesus's crucifixion and resurrection, in that it's quite acontextualized and spiritualized. So it's just about Jesus dying for our sins so that our relationship with God can be restored. And it's seen as part of this cosmic plan. And I'm not necessarily saying anything against that, but it's seen as very much abstracted from the actual place and time that Jesus was living in, and what that death on the cross actually was. Like, it wasn't just that they decided to kill him so that people's sins could be removed or whatever. He was killed because he was going up against the powers of the day, the colonial powers of the day, the religious powers of the day. He was challenging different things wherever he saw them and was doing things that were not acceptable to the social norms of the day. And that got him into trouble, and that was why he was crucified. So he was murdered by the forces that were in power at the time. And I think when we erase that from our story, we can wield that in whatever way we like. But when we recognize that Jesus was crucified because of his politics and because he was challenging the politics of the day, then I think we don't have a choice but to, if we claim to follow Jesus, to do the same things and to challenge the dehumanizing and marginalizing forces and politics of our day. So it's very tactical and strategic to, I think, contextualize it, because it means that you can claim that Christianity is not political, and you can say that as the church we need to be neutral and we don't need to get involved in politics. But once you recognize that Jesus' death was extremely political, you have no choice. You can't just ignore that. And it means that our faith actually must be political if we really are following Jesus. So, I mean, I think that's definitely one thing. And then I think just to also note, like, the way that I think people have made that story their own has been really important in different traditions of liberation theology. You talked about James Cone with Black theology in the US, and he talks about the God of the oppressed, and this Jesus who is crucified is like Black people of today who are daily crucified by the different things. I mean, he talks about the cross and the lynching tree, so was tying it to the specific context of Black people being lynched in the US. And then here you have Black theologians in like the 70s and 80s who also were making similar connections and saying that in the same way that Jesus was crucified on the cross, Black people are being crucified with the military coming in and invading townships and meting out violence on Black bodies. And Jesus being crucified in this context looks like Black people being imprisoned without any rights. It looks like all of the kinds of societal violence that Black people experience. So I think, that says so much. I think a lot of this conversation is also recognizing, who's telling the story and why people are telling what story. Because I think, what I always talk about and I love to talk about, and that really was part of some of these liberation theology movements in South Africa, but was thinking about the church and actually the Bible as sites of struggle. So recognizing that it's not one voice, it's not one story, but there's different clashes of power going on here. And that comes out in what our theology is saying and doing, what our churches are saying and doing, what we make the Bible say and do. And so then it becomes a thing of needing to make your context clear. So not just saying that this is a theology that has come down from heaven, it's the universal truth, but saying we're actually doing this from a place of empire, and that is impacting the kinds of theology we're creating. Yeah. Or we are doing that as Black people under apartheid in South Africa. And so this is what we're doing. And each group or whatever is appropriating and making their own these things in different ways. And I think that's something that we have to recognize, like, there's that option, and that's where the idea of the Bible as a site of struggle comes into play. That's saying, and that was Itumeleng Mosala, and it was very contentious even within Black theology and contextual theology. But he was saying the Bible itself isn't a document of liberation, and if we say that it is, then it will actually have the effect of continuing to oppress. So we have to recognize that the Bible itself is a site of struggle. There's different powers warring within its pages, and represented in its pages, and even in what's there and what's not there. So taking the Bible seriously is also taking the silences seriously, and the people whose voices are not represented in that. And if we do that, then it can be appropriated in a way towards liberation, but it's only in recognizing that struggle is there, and that it's not a clear text either way, but by recognizing that it actually can become something that becomes liberating, and that leads us to a vision of something different. So even, I mean, just that thing of site of struggle, I feel like is helpful, because it's like, it's not surprised by white Jesus and Black Jesus. It's like, yes, this is going on. And so we need to be very intentional about how we are reading and what we're doing. And I think that's not to say I don't think the Bible or Christianity or Jesus is saying anything, and I don't think there's an actual contextual reality. I do, and I think that's why making Jesus's context is so important, because I think that actually gives us some clear guidance on what Jesus was doing and what following Jesus then should look like.
So your answer to that lady about which Bible are you I don't know which Bible are you reading, or she asked the question, which Bible are you reading, would be, well, we're reading the same Bible really, but what we are appropriating it towards is very different. And there's various factors that are allowing for both of those things. And so the more you take context seriously, both our own context as well as the biblical context, the closer you will get to a faithful reading of the text. So I think I do think there's totally not faithful readings of the text, and that can be a reason why she thinks the Bible can say we are okay with genocide, for example. So I'm not saying the Bible doesn't say anything, but I'm saying it's not. We can get a clear understanding of what it is trying to say if we look at context, but there's also some things that stump us in there, that are like, what do we do with this? And so for me, reading our own context well and reading the biblical text well, and digging into what feels like God's vision for a world where everyone and everything is flourishing, and reading it faithfully to that, I think we get closer to what God wants for the world. So I'm not saying it's a free for all, but that we have to recognize these elements going on to allow us to read it faithfully. Okay, so we've spoken now at length about, relative length, about the crucifixion, and also I guess you were speaking about a faithful reading of the scripture, and that there is that you can get to at least closer to that in some ways. And so if we were to think about the resurrection as something that happened, I guess as a historic event in itself, but also in symbolically what it means, if we were to think of something like, I guess I would say like a resurrection theology, in material terms here today, what does that mean? Also considering that when we spoke about Black Jesus answering the prayers of oppressed Black masses, when we talk about, maybe it's a bit controversial to say this even, but when we talk about white Jesus, the characteristics and traits of that story of Jesus is victory and triumph and flourishing, which is good. Like, who doesn't want that? And I wondered what you think about, like, what does brown Jesus do with the resurrection, and where do those kinds of things fit in?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, yeah, it's so interesting in many ways. I think that almost makes me think again of your story, Rashid, about the man who said this prayer and then nothing was changed in his life, and similarly about these people who had been waiting for a Messiah to come and overthrow Rome, overthrow the colonial powers, and then things would be completely different. And that's not what Jesus's life was, and it's not how things ended with the resurrection. That didn't happen. Something happened, but it wasn't that. So it was, I think, very unexpected. And I think part of it is the vision for something different. Like Jesus throughout his life also talked about this kingdom that's at hand, and often in the Bible we see glimpses of what the vision for that kingdom looks like, and it's one where everyone has what they need and the earth is flourishing and people are flourishing. And so I think for me sometimes those things in a certain way become more important than the resurrection, or what we need to. They're the things that we need to work out, I think, from the place of the resurrection in a certain kind of way, and recognize that that's not the end of the story. I think it makes possible certain things, and I think it's the whole thing is quite mysterious, I would say, and I think we don't fully understand the significance, maybe, or know exactly what happened, but I think it's interesting looking at what happened after that as well, and looking at things in the book of Acts and the new possibilities that seemed to be facilitated by Jesus's life and death and then resurrection, and this new community that was birthed, who was defying the different social powers and social dynamics of the time, and living in very alternative ways, living in ways that were completely against the norms and the logic of the wider society, living very generously and giving away land and selling land so that everyone would have what they need, sharing everything that they had, truly being in community. Victory. We are not so different. They, waiting for the promised Messiah to deliver them from their colonial powers, hoping for the day exploitation, oppression, and brutalization would be no more, praying and preparing for revolution, forward to the New Jerusalem. Thousands of years later, the scenery is unchanged. Still, we wait for the Messiah to deliver us from our colonial powers. Still, we hope for the day exploitation, oppression, and brutalization will be no more. Still, we pray and prepare for revolution, forward to the New Jerusalem. It's like déjà vu. I wonder what it felt like to realize that Jesus was the Messiah, this person that seemed not that different from them, who preached loving your enemies and praying for those who persecute you. I wonder how it felt to realize that this was it, that there was no one else, no armies on horseback with vengeance in their swords, just Jesus. This man who had power but was always using it in the wrong places, to heal lepers and unclean women, to give bread to the hungry. Jesus, you're thinking too small, they must have thought. You could bring this whole thing to the ground. Yet he continued to waste his time playing with little children. I wonder what it was like for Peter, who looked into Jesus' eyes and was unable to deny that he was the Christ, to realize that the Messiah looked a lot different than he had anticipated. But somehow his spirit recognized redemption standing before him. I wonder how it felt to see redemption die, crucified by the hands of those he should have defeated. It doesn't seem like much of a victory. And it leads me to wonder what victory means, what redemption means, what a faithful response should be to this world where evil seems to have free reign. Because I can't deny that when I look into his eyes, I too see redemption. And I see the new world built on foundations of justice and peace and love. The new world whose bricks are the healing of lepers and unclean women, whose pillars are bread for the hungry, whose concrete is time wasted playing with children. And perhaps the new world will only ever exist in his eyes and in our minds. But if our redemption lies in the building, we cannot but continue to build. So in a certain way, I think maybe to understand the resurrection, we have to look almost beyond the resurrection to some of the things that it birthed. And I think maybe see it as something which I think you guys in your last podcast talked about looking for the gaps. And maybe it's something that opens up a gap for the possibility for something different. And the possibility that we can live as I think in the creation story it was intended, of goodness between all things. I think it allows the possibility that there can be a state and a reality where there is goodness between humans and each other, goodness between humans and God, goodness between humans and the earth, goodness between all things. And I think it represents hope for those who are oppressed, who are suffering, who are trying to push against the powers of the time. I think it represents hope that things won't always be like that.
That's powerful.
Yeah.
Thanks, Thandi.
Thanks, Thandi.
Sure, thank you for having me.
It's amazing.
Fun.
Fun.